The music throbbed in my ears as I stepped into the dimly lit bar, my heels clicking against the wooden floor. My best friend Megan had dragged me out tonight, insisting that I needed to get out of the house. "You've been moping for weeks, Claire," she had said, her voice tinged with concern. "It's time to move on." Move on. The words echoed bitterly in my mind. How do you move on from discovering that the man you built your life with, the man you trusted with your heart, had been sneaking around behind your back? He hadn't even bothered to deny it when I confronted him, just stared at me with cold, detached eyes as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience. That was 3 weeks ago, and I still hadn't decided what to do. Leave? Fight for my marriage? Or just crumble into a heap and let the world move on without me? Megan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a lively corner of the bar. "You're going to have fun tonight, I promise. Drinks, dancing, no drama." Her tone was almost maternal, as if scolding me into happiness. I tried to smile, but it felt like my lips barely moved. The truth was, I didn't want to be here. But Megan was relentless, so I let her guide me to a table near a group of women who were already well into their second, or maybe third round of cocktails. They were loud, laughing in that uninhibited way people do when they're celebrating something big. Balloons floated above their table, tied down with glittery weights, and a sash-reading bride-to-be was draped over the back of one chair. A bachelorette party. I watched them out of the corner of my eye, noting the shiny plastic tiaras, the ridiculous feather boas, and the way they passed around an oversized glass filled with what looked like neon blue margaritas. Megan noticed too and gave me a nudge. "Looks like they're having fun. Maybe we should join them." "Not a chance," I muttered. But Megan was already waving at one of the women. Before I knew it, we were pulled into their orbit. The bride-to-be was seated at the head of the table, glowing with excitement. Her friends surrounded her, showering her with attention, laughter, and compliments. I tried not to look too closely, but there was something familiar about her. She had a delicate face, framed by soft blonde curls, and her laughter was almost musical. She seemed younger than me, mid-20s maybe. I ordered a drink, telling myself I'd stay for an hour at most. Megan was chatting with one of the bridesmaids, and I found myself caught in their circle of conversation. They were talking about the wedding, how it was coming up so quickly, how perfect the venue was going to be, how the groom was an absolute dream. "My fiancé is incredible," the bride-to-be gushed, her cheeks flushing pink from either the alcohol or her excitement. "I can't believe how lucky I am. He's so thoughtful, so charming. And the way he proposed." She sighed dramatically, and her friends squealed in unison. I forced a tight smile, trying to tune them out. This was supposed to be a distraction, not a front-row seat to someone else's perfect love story. I reached for my drink, hoping the alcohol would dull the edges of my mood, but then I heard it, his name. "Jack," she said, her voice dreamy. "He's just everything I ever wanted." The glass slipped from my hand, spilling vodka tonic across the table. My heart stopped. I turned to face her fully, my pulse thundering in my ears. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The bride-to-be looked startled, her wide blue eyes meeting mine. "I said Jack," she repeated cautiously. "He's my fiancé." The world tilted on its axis. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was a mistake. It had to be. There were thousands of Jacks in the city, tens of thousands probably. Couldn't be him. Couldn't. But as I stared at her, my mind began to assemble the pieces. The late nights at work, the unexplained absences, the sudden need for space. And now this woman sitting in front of me, talking about marrying the man I had spent the last 7 years of my life with. My stomach twisted into knots, and my hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Megan noticed my change in demeanor and leaned in. "Claire, what's wrong?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy fighting the urge to scream. Instead, I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Excuse me," I muttered, grabbing my bag and pushing my way through the crowd. I stumbled out onto the street, the cool night air hitting my flushed face like a slap. My mind raced, a chaotic tangle of anger, disbelief, and gut-wrenching pain. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning a whole new life with someone else. He was going to marry her. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. A cold, determined resolve. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not without a fight. I pulled out my phone and started searching for wedding venues in the city. If their wedding was as soon as she had hinted, it wouldn't be hard to track down the details. I'd spent years managing Jack's calendar, booking his flights, organizing his meetings. I knew how he thought, how he operated. And now I was going to use that knowledge against him. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and digging through every piece of information I could find. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed: the venue, the guest list, even the caterer schedule. I wasn't entirely sure what my plan was yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was going to show up at that wedding, and I was going to make damn sure he regretted every single lie he ever told me. On the morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully, choosing a sleek black dress that clung to my curves in all the right places. I wanted to look powerful, unshakable, like the kind of woman who couldn't be ignored. As I applied my makeup, I practiced what I would say. There were so many things I wanted to scream at him, so many truths I wanted to throw in his face. But when the time came, I knew I'd only have one chance to make my point. The venue was a sprawling garden estate on the outskirts of the city. Guests milled about in their finest attire, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. I slipped in unnoticed, blending into the crowd as I made my way toward the ceremony space. And then I saw him, standing at the altar, looking every bit the charming, polished man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. My heart twisted painfully in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. This wasn't about love anymore. This was about justice. When the music started and the bride began her walk down the aisle, I stepped forward. Every head turned as I spoke, my voice ringing out clear and steady. Stop the wedding. The gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. A collective intake of breath as every pair of eyes snapped to me. For a moment there was only stunned silence. Even the bride froze mid-step, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Jack's face went pale as death, his confident composure shattering in an instant. He took a hesitant step forward, his mouth opening and closing as if he were grasping for the right words, but no sound came out. I squared my shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment settle on me. The adrenaline coursing through my veins drowned out my fear, leaving only a sharp, almost feral determination. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything he had done. This wedding can't happen, I said, my voice louder now, ringing with a clarity that cut through the stunned crowd. Because this man, your so-called perfect groom, is already married. To me. The bride's face crumpled in confusion, her lips parting as if she couldn't quite process the words. Her friends and family exchanged bewildered glances, murmurs spreading like wildfire. But it was Jack's reaction that I focused on. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route, his jaw tightening as he tried to regain control. "Claire," he hissed, his voice low and urgent, as though he could somehow make me stop with just my name. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I shot back, taking a step closer. "I could ask you the same thing, Jack. Last I checked, we were still married. Or did you forget that little detail while you were planning your dream wedding with someone else?" The bride let out a soft, choked sound, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears began to well in her eyes, and I almost felt a pang of sympathy for her. Almost. But then I reminded myself that whether or not she knew about me, she was standing at the altar, ready to take my husband from me. She wasn't blameless in this. "Is this true?" she whispered, turning to Jack with a look of desperate pleading. "Jack, what is she talking about?" Jack raised his hands, palms out, like a man trying to calm a raging fire. "Sarah, listen to me. It's not what it looks like." "Oh, don't you dare," I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to slice through steel. "Don't you dare try to spin this into something it's not. You lied to her just like you lied to me. Tell her the truth, Jack. Tell everyone here the truth." By now, the guests were on their feet, the elegant ceremony unraveling into chaos. The officiant looked utterly horrified, clutching his little book like a lifeline. The wedding planner hovered at the edge of the scene, frantically whispering into a headset, no doubt trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. But there was no salvaging it. Not for Jack. Not for any of us. "All right," Jack snapped, his voice rising as he finally dropped the act. His eyes blazed with anger and something else, panic. "All right, yes, okay? I'm married to her. But it's not like it sounds. Claire and I were done. We've been done for a long time. Oh really? I shot back, my voice dripping with venom. Funny, because I don't remember signing any divorce papers. I don't remember having a single conversation about being done. All I remember is you sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, and playing house with your little girlfriend here. Sarah let out a strangled sob, her bouquet hitting the ground as she turned on Jack, her tear-streaked face contorted with betrayal. You told me you were divorced, she cried, her voice breaking. You promised me. I was going to tell you, Jack said, his tone desperate now. I needed time to figure everything out. Figure everything out? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Is that what you call this? Marrying someone else without even ending your first marriage? Did you think you could just juggle us? Did you think I wouldn't find out? I didn't want to hurt anyone, he muttered, his voice barely audible. The words hit me like a slap, the sheer absurdity of them igniting something deep and raw inside me. You didn't want to hurt anyone? I echoed, my voice rising. Well, congratulations, Jack. You've managed to hurt everyone. Sarah's friends were now pulling her away, their faces a mix of pity and anger as they cast accusing glances at Jack. The guests were no longer murmuring. They were openly talking, the scandal rippling through the crowd like a live wire. Someone even had their phone out, recording the entire debacle. Good, I thought. Let the world see this. Let everyone see exactly who Jack really is. For a moment, Jack just stood there, his shoulders slumping under the weight of it all. He looked small, pathetic, like a man who had finally realized the walls were closing in. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing through the garden gates as the crowd parted to let him pass. I stood there, my chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly draining out of me. The bride, Sarah, looked at me one last time, her face a mixture of devastation and gratitude, as if she didn't know whether to hate me or thank me for exposing the truth. Then she too turned and fled, her bridesmaids trailing after her. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the distance as they made their way toward the parking lot. The beautiful, carefully planned wedding was over, ruined beyond repair. And yet, as I stood there in the wreckage of it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: relief. Jack was gone, and with him the lies and the deceit that had poisoned my life for so long. For the first time I felt free. I walked out of that garden with my head held high, leaving the chaos behind me. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone make me feel small or powerless again. As I stepped away from the chaos, my heels clicking softly against the gravel path leading out of the garden, a strange calm washed over me. The tight knot of anger and betrayal that had been choking me for weeks seemed to loosen. It wasn't entirely gone, but the weight of it had shifted. For the first time I could breathe. The crisp afternoon air filled my lungs, carrying with it a sense of finality. I didn't look back at the guests or the mess I'd left behind. They weren't my concern anymore. Let Jack and Sarah deal with the fallout. Let their families gossip and dissect every detail of the disaster I just caused. My part in their story was over. Or maybe their part in mine was. Either way, I knew I couldn't waste another second standing in the rubble of a life Jack had tried to destroy. When I reached the parking lot, Megan was leaning against my car, arms crossed and a mix of worry and awe on her face. She must have followed me out after realizing something had gone wrong. Claire, she said softly as I approached, her eyes scanning me for signs of emotional collapse. Are you okay? What the hell happened in there? For a moment I didn't answer. I just stood there, staring at the gravel beneath my feet, feeling the weight of her question. Was I okay? Could anyone be okay after what I had just done? After learning that the man they loved had not only betrayed them but was on the verge of marrying someone else? But then, to my own surprise, I let out a small, shaky laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy or amusement. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you realize you've survived something you thought might destroy you. I think I am, I said finally, meeting her eyes. Or, I will be. Megan exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing as she stepped closer and pulled me into a tight hug. You're the bravest person I know, she whispered. Seriously, Claire, what you just did. It took guts. I rested my chin on her shoulder, letting the warmth of her support ground me. I don't know if it was brave or just reckless, I admitted. But it's done. And honestly, I don't regret it. He deserved every second of that. When we pulled apart, Megan gave me one of her signature wry smiles. Well, you definitely gave everyone something to talk about. That video's probably already viral. I groaned, running a hand through my hair. Great. Just what I needed. My humiliation immortalized on the internet. Humiliation? Megan scoffed. You weren't humiliated. You were powerful. You stood up for yourself in front of an entire crowd of people. You made sure everyone saw the truth. That's not humiliation, Claire, that's a mic drop. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to see myself the way she did, strong, unbreakable. A woman who had taken control of her own narrative. But part of me still felt raw and exposed, as though the world had seen something far too intimate, far too personal. Maybe, I said, my voice softer now. But what happens next? What do I do now? Megan tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. You start over, she said simply. You pick up the pieces one by one, and figure out what kind of life you want to build for yourself. Without him. And I'll be right here to help you. The sincerity in her voice brought a lump to my throat. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't the end, it was a beginning. A chance to reclaim my life and build something better, stronger. We got into the car and drove back to my apartment. The silence between us comfortable and reassuring. Megan stayed with me that night, refusing to leave me alone, even though I insisted I was fine. We ordered takeout, drank wine, and talked late into the night, not about Jack or the wedding but about everything else, the trips we wanted to take, the goals we'd been putting off, the kind of future that felt possible now that the past had finally been put to rest. In the days that followed, I began to piece my life back together. I filed for divorce, even though Jack's cowardly flight from the altar had already made it clear there was no going back. The process was messy and painful, as I expected it would be, but each step felt like a small victory. A way of reclaiming control over something he had tried to take from me. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects that challenged me and reminded me of my own capabilities. I joined a gym, not because I wanted to reinvent myself physically, but because I needed an outlet for the frustration and anger that still bubbled beneath the surface. And slowly, little by little, I began to feel like myself again. Megan was my rock through it all, refusing to let me wallow in self-pity or second-guess my decisions. She dragged me out to dinners, introduced me to new people, and reminded me, constantly, that I deserved more than what Jack had given me. That I deserved happiness. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when I missed the familiarity of having someone to come home to, even if that someone had betrayed me. There were moments when the anger flared up again, hot and blinding, and I had to remind myself to breathe. But with each passing day, the pain lessened. The scars began to heal. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, I found myself walking through the park near my apartment, the leaves crunching underfoot and the cool air nipping at my cheeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. The world had moved on, and so had I. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the woman who would tolerate lies, betrayal, or half measures. I was stronger now, wiser, and no matter what came next, I would face it with the same determination that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. Jack had taken so much from me, but he hadn't broken me. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. Not the one filled with shared dinners, weekend getaways, and whispered dreams with Jack, but it was mine. I claimed it piece by piece, learning to savor the quiet victories. The way the light filtered through my kitchen window in the morning, the satisfaction of finishing a book I'd been meaning to read for years, the exhilarating freedom of making plans without having to check anyone else's schedule. I thought about Jack less often. His name no longer sent a jolt of pain through me. Instead, it lingered like the faint memory of a bad dream. Every now and then, I would hear snippets from mutual acquaintances, how he'd left the city, how he was laying low after the public spectacle of the wedding that Sarah, it seemed, had gone her own way too. I imagined her picking up her shattered pieces just as I had, forging a new path for herself, perhaps wiser now to the red flag she'd ignored before. A part of me wished her well. Another part didn't care enough to think about her at all. Instead, I focused on myself. I took a solo trip to Maine, driving along the coast with the windows down, the salty breeze filling my car as I stopped at every little roadside stand and quaint seaside town I passed. I hiked trails that left my legs aching and my lungs burning, the kind of exhaustion that felt cleansing, like I was purging the remnants of my old life with every step. I watched sunsets alone, marveling at the beauty of them without feeling the need to share it with anyone else. For the first time, I realized I didn't need someone to complete me. I was already whole. But the world has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. One crisp November afternoon, I was browsing a local farmer's market, a knit scarf wrapped tightly around my neck as I admired the colorful displays of apples and pumpkins. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the simple pleasure of being outside, surrounded by the hum of life. That's when I saw him. He was standing by a stall selling jars of honey, his head bent as he chatted with the vendor. His laugh, deep and rich, carried across the cool air, making me pause mid-step. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the sunlight in a way that made me blink. I didn't know why I was staring, but something about him held my attention. It wasn't just his looks, though they were striking. It was the way he seemed so at ease, as if he belonged entirely in that moment, unhurried and unbothered by the chaos of the world. I shook myself, feeling a little foolish. It wasn't like me to gawk at strangers. I turned my attention back to the apples in front of me, pretending to inspect them while silently willing my heartbeat to slow. But as fate, or perhaps sheer coincidence, would have it, he noticed me too. "Looks like you're as indecisive about apples as I am about honey," he said, his voice warm and teasing. I glanced up to find him standing a few feet away, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I felt a flush creep up my neck, caught off guard by his easy confidence. "It's not indecision," I said, forcing a light tone. "I'm just being thorough." "Ah," he said with a mock serious nod. The mark of a true apple connoisseur. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising even me. It had been a long time since I'd felt this kind of lightness, this effortless connection with someone. There was no weight of expectation, no history or baggage hanging over us. Just two people standing in a market, trading playful banter over fruit and honey. We ended up walking through the market together, talking about everything and nothing. His name was Ben, and he owned a small woodworking business in town, crafting custom furniture and decor. He told me about the cabin he'd built himself, tucked away in the woods, where he spent his evenings listening to vinyl records and watching the stars. There was a quiet steadiness about him, a groundedness that made me feel safe even though we had only just met. When the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the market, he asked if I'd like to grab a cup of coffee. For a moment I hesitated. Letting someone new into my life felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, and part of me wasn't sure I was ready. But then I looked at him, at the kindness in his eyes, the way he waited patiently for my answer without pressuring me, and I decided to take the leap. Over coffee we talked until the sky turned dark, sharing stories about our pasts, our dreams, and the little things that made us who we were. I told him about my disastrous marriage, carefully edited of course, leaving out the most painful details, and he told me about his own heartbreaks, the moments that had shaped him. There was no pretense between us, no games or masks, just honesty. As the weeks turned into months, Ben became a part of my life. Not in the way Jack had been, as someone who consumed all my time and energy, but as a partner who added to it. He encouraged me to chase my dreams, to take risks, to believe in myself again. He wasn't perfect and neither was I, but together we created something that felt real and solid. One evening as we sat on the porch of his cabin, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars, he reached for my hand. "You've been through so much, Claire," he said softly, "but you've come out stronger. I don't know how you did it, but I'm glad you did. Because it led you here." I didn't have the words to respond, so I just leaned into him, letting the warmth of his presence fill the spaces that had once felt so empty. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And for that, I would always be grateful. Life with Ben was different in the best possible way. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the small, steady moments that made up our days. It was about the way he'd leave a steaming mug of coffee on the bedside table before heading out to his workshop in the mornings, or the way we'd sit on the floor in his cabin, painting a new piece of furniture together and laughing when one of us inevitably spilled. It was the way he listened, truly listened when I talked about my dreams and fears, and the way he made me feel like I could conquer anything just by standing by my side. For a while, I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. After everything I'd been through with Jack, it was hard to believe that something this good, this simple and honest, could last. I caught myself second-guessing, looking for cracks that weren't there, bracing for disappointment even when there was no reason to. Ben noticed, of course. He had a way of seeing right through me, his quiet perceptiveness both comforting and unnerving. One evening, as we sat by the fire in his cabin, I finally confessed my fears. "I don't want to mess this up," I admitted, staring into the flickering flames. "Sometimes I feel like I'm waiting for it all to fall apart. Like I don't know how to trust it, how to trust you." Ben didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached over and took my hand, his thumb brushing gently against my knuckles. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, just like him. "You've been hurt, Claire. It's natural to feel that way after what you've been through. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm not Jack. And you don't have to trust everything all at once. We can take it one day at a time, as slow as you need. I'll be here." His words settled over me like a warm blanket, soothing the jagged edges of my doubt. For the first time, I felt like I didn't have to rush to prove anything to myself or to him. I could just be. And that was enough. The seasons shifted, the snow melting into spring, and our lives continued to intertwine in ways I hadn't expected. Ben's woodworking business grew, his custom pieces gaining attention from clients far beyond our little town. I found myself helping him more and more, sketching designs and managing orders, discovering a creative side of myself I hadn't tapped into before. It wasn't the life I had envisioned years ago, but it felt right in a way that nothing else ever had. One day, as we were sanding down the rough edges of a dining table he'd been working on for weeks, he paused and looked at me, his hands covered in sawdust. "You know," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious, "I think we make a pretty good team." I laughed, brushing a stray strand of hair out of my face. "You mean when I'm not spilling paint on your projects?" "Exactly," he said, grinning. "But seriously, Claire, I've been thinking about the future. About what we could build together, not just in here but out there. A life, a home, whatever that looks like for us." My heart skipped a beat, his words both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was something just as significant. It was a promise, an invitation to dream about a future that wasn't weighed down by the past. And for the first time, I allowed myself to accept it. To imagine a life with him, full of all the quiet joys and messy imperfections that made us who we were. As spring turned into summer, we began to talk more about what that future might look like. We didn't rush into anything. There was no timeline, no pressure. But the conversations came naturally, like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. We talked about renovating the cabin to make more space, about maybe getting a dog, about the possibility of traveling someday, once his business was a little more established. It wasn't about big, sweeping plans. It was about building a foundation together, one step at a time. But life, of course, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old papers in my apartment, I came across a manila envelope I hadn't touched in months. Inside were the final divorce papers from Jack. I'd signed them long ago, sent them off to the courthouse, and filed the confirmation away without a second thought. But seeing them again brought back a flood of memories. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the humiliation of that day at the altar. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the envelope in my hands. I thought about how far I'd come since then, how much had changed. Jack no longer held any power over me, but the scars he left behind were still there, faint but present. I wondered if they always would be, and if that was something I could truly live with. When I told Ben about finding the papers, he listened quietly, his expression unreadable. "Does it still hurt?" he asked after a long pause. "Not in the same way," I admitted. "It's more like a shadow. It's there, but it doesn't consume me anymore. It reminds me of what I've lost, but also of what I've gained." Ben nodded, his eyes softening. "You've gained a lot, Claire. Don't forget that. And you've taught me something too, about resilience, about fighting for yourself. I've never met anyone as strong as you." His words stayed with me long after that conversation, echoing in my mind as I began to let go of the last remnants of my old life. The shadows were still there, but they didn't scare me anymore. They were a part of my story, but they didn't define it. I was more than what I had lost. I was more than the woman Jack had tried to leave behind. By the time fall rolled around again, I found myself standing on the porch of the cabin, a steaming mug of cider in my hands as I watched the leaves change colors. Ben was beside me, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, and the air was crisp with the promise of new beginnings. "I think we've got something good here," he said, his voice low and content. I smiled, leaning into him. "Yeah," I said softly. "We really do." As the days passed, the piece of our life together began to feel less like something temporary and more like something permanent, as though we'd carved out a space in the world that was ours alone. Ben and I settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. We didn't talk about the past much anymore. There was no need. It was there, of course, like an old scar, but it no longer defined who I was or what we were building. Instead, we focused on the present, on the quiet, unremarkable moments that made life worth living. I found myself spending more and more time at the cabin, until one day, it just made sense to stop calling my apartment home. There was no grand discussion about it, no decision to pack up my things all at once. It happened gradually, as my clothes began to fill his closet and my books appeared on his shelves. One day I realized I hadn't been back to my apartment in weeks. When I mentioned it to Ben, he just smiled and said, "I was wondering when you'd figure that out." Moving in with him felt different from the life I'd built with Jack. It wasn't about merging two carefully curated lives into one picture-perfect image. With Ben, there were no expectations, no pressure to perform or conform. Our home was a reflection of us, messy and perfect, but full of warmth and laughter. It was the kind of life I hadn't known I wanted until I found it. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ben turned to me with a thoughtful look on his face. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "about the cabin, about what we could make of it." I tilted my head, curious. "What do you mean?" "Well," he began, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees, "you've been doing so much with the business lately, sketching designs, helping with orders. You're good at it, Claire. Really good. What if we expanded? What if this wasn't just a workshop but something bigger? A studio, maybe. A place where we could both work, where we could bring people in to see what we do. A real partnership." The idea took me by surprise. I'd always thought of Ben's woodworking as his domain, something I helped with on the side, but the way he spoke about it made me realize he saw it differently. He didn't just want me to be involved, he wanted me to share it with him, to make it ours. "I don't know," I said hesitantly. "That's a big step. What if it doesn't work?" "Then it doesn't work," he said simply, turning to face me. "But I think it will. And if it doesn't, we'll figure something else out. Together." His faith in me was humbling, and for a moment I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Let's think about it," I said finally. "Let's take it one step at a time." We did think about it long and hard. Over the next few months, we started laying the groundwork for something new. We cleared out an old shed on the property and turned it into a small showroom, displaying Ben's furniture alongside some of the smaller pieces I'd started making. Painted signs, hand-carved trays, and other little items that added a personal touch. It wasn't much at first, but it was ours, and the response from the community was more than we could have hoped for. Word spread quickly, and before long we found ourselves juggling more orders than we could handle. It was chaotic, exhausting, and utterly exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, something that mattered. And every step of the way, Ben was there, his steady presence grounding me even when the doubts tried to creep in. Our little business became a part of the community, and with it, so did we. People stopped by not just to shop but to chat, to share stories, to connect. It was the kind of life I'd always dreamed of but never quite believed was possible. And as the months turned into years, it became clear that this wasn't just a chapter in my life. It was the story I was meant to write all along. One crisp winter morning, as the first snow of the season dusted the ground, I woke to find Ben sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands and a thoughtful expression on his face. He didn't notice me at first, his gaze fixed on something outside the window, and I took a moment to watch him, marveling at how effortlessly he had become my home. When he finally turned and saw me, he smiled, the kind of smile that made my heart feel like it might burst. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. "Morning," I replied, crossing the room to join him. "What are you thinking about?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his mug. "I was thinking about us," he said finally. "About everything we've built here. And about what comes next." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you mean?" He reached across the table and took my hand, his eyes meeting mine. "I mean, I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Claire. I want to keep building this life together, whatever it looks like. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment I could hardly breathe. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, over-the-top proposal I might have imagined years ago. There were no grand gestures, no crowds of people watching. It was quiet, intimate, and utterly perfect, just like us. "Yes," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. "Yes, I will." Ben's smile widened, and he stood, pulling me into his arms. As he held me, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us and the life we'd built together. It wasn't the life I'd planned or the one I'd thought I wanted, but it was more than enough. It was everything. The days following Ben's proposal were a blur of joy and quiet anticipation. Unlike my first engagement, which had been marked by flashy announcements and elaborate plans, this time it felt different, simpler, more grounded. We didn't rush into planning a wedding or worry about what anyone else thought. Instead, we took our time, savoring the idea of spending our lives together without the pressure of timelines or expectations. It wasn't about the wedding. It was about the marriage, the partnership we had already started building piece by piece. Winter settled in fully, blanketing the cabin in snow and transforming the woods around us into a serene, frosted wonderland. Business slowed as the holidays approached, giving us a chance to breathe and reflect on everything we had accomplished in the past year. On quiet evenings, we would sit by the fire with mugs of hot chocolate, dreaming out loud about the future. Some nights we talked about expanding the business further, maybe even opening a proper storefront in town. Other nights we simply enjoyed the silence, the comfort of being together without the need for words. When spring finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal and possibility. The snow melted, giving way to lush greenery and blooming wildflowers. We began working on the cabin again, making small improvements to the space we now shared fully. Ben built a new bookshelf for my ever-growing collection of novels, while I painted the kitchen cabinets a cheerful shade of blue. Every project we tackled together felt like another brick in the foundation of the life we were creating. As the months went on, our little showroom gained more attention. People came from neighboring towns to see Ben's handcrafted furniture, and soon we had a steady stream of visitors every weekend. One day, a couple from the city stopped by and asked if we ever hosted workshops. The idea intrigued us, and after a long conversation over dinner that night, we decided to give it a try. Ben taught the woodworking classes, guiding participants through the process of building their own small pieces, while I handled the creative side, painting, finishing, and adding personal touches. The workshops were a success, and with them came a new sense of purpose. Watching people light up as they created something with their own hands reminded me of the joy I had found in rediscovering myself after everything with Jack. It wasn't just about the pieces we sold or the money we made. It was about connection, about sharing something meaningful with others.